And Paul Blaney is our speaker this morning. I already apologized to Paul and everybody. I do not have an introduction, so he's going to introduce himself. But his talk this morning is titled No Fairs. I don't know what this will be about, but it sounds interesting. Take it away, Paul.
I guess I could just say our speaker today needs no introduction.
I'm going to go in the other room so you can listen to TV. Okay.
I want to move on with my talk. The title is No Fairs, No Fairs. A couple of titles that would also have been apt are Justice and Equity. Equity might have led you to expect a talk on investment strategies, which this is not. Justice would have suggested broader coverage than I can manage, so it's No Fairs. What led to that title occurred on Christmas morning of 2017. Our living room was filled with an extended family group, which included 3 sisters, one age 8 and twins age 6. Nancy and I don't spend a lot of time around kids, so this was a great treat for us. Santa had known where to leave the presents, so it was a scene of rampant gift opening. So what was the chatter when one of the girls would open a present? If you've not been around kids much recently, perhaps you're thinking it was, "Dearest sister, I'm so happy for you that you received such a delightful gift. You deserve no less." Well, yes, there were signs of shared delight, but the phrase that the girls more often shouted was, "No fairs." Now, were these children deprived? No. Was this a particularly fractious family? No. Were these kids unusually spoiled or greedy? I don't think so. No fairs is just what kids, siblings especially, say in such situations. So that's my sermon title. Now for my text. Every sermon has to have a text. Mine is a cartoon, one that is pegged to the word equity, sent to me by a cousin in Texas who's in his late 80s. I'll hold it up, and I guess probably you can all see it now, but it's backward, isn't it? I mean, the wording is obviously. On this side is the word equality, and you see the 3 boys each standing in a box. And on this side is equity, and you can see that the box has been shifted, one box has been shifted from under the tall boy to be under the short boy. So that's my text. And we'll come back to it from time to time. The traditional text or sermon, of course, is not a cartoon, but a biblical passage. And so I did search the Bible for the word justice. It appears many, many times. But one recurrent theme in those passages is the vulnerability of the poor to injustice, the special importance of treating the poor justly. Sounds about right. Getting back to those little girls on Christmas and their preoccupation with fairness around the Christmas tree, you've perhaps heard of research that shows that something similar happens among mammals, other mammals than humans. The first findings were among primates. When monkeys who had been trained to do a task for a cucumber saw another monkey was getting a more delicious reward for the same task, they would suddenly act insulted by the cucumber and eventually stop performing. Similar effects have been more recently shown among dogs. A dog who had seemed very happy to obey a command without any reward would quit performing the task upon seeing that another dog was rewarded for it. Getting back to humans, loving adults are aware of these tendencies. So they try to avoid hurt feelings and rebellion by avoiding preferential treatment. When our son Evan was a preschooler 40 years ago, he and a little boy named Laban were cared for by a young woman who was attuned to these matters. So as she gave them some kind of treat, She described what she was giving as an equal piece. Our boy Evan heard the phrase equal piece so often that even when he was the only kid around, he would sometimes say, "May I please have an equal piece?" It was very charming, but it was part of his world. But of course, the caregiver did not really treat the boys equally at all times and in all ways. Why? They had different interests, different needs, different talents, which brings us back to the cartoon. The basis for the cartoon is obvious. What is not important is having a box. What is important is being able to see the ball game. The middle boy can do so with his one box, his equal piece, so to speak, but the little boy could not, however, until he was given the big boy's equal piece as well. So at least as the words equality and equity are used in the cartoon, the real gold standard is not for fairness is not equality, but equity. And perhaps it's obvious. Greatest good for the greatest number, each according to his needs. Nobody gets extra until everyone has enough. Cooperation is what matters, and so on and so on. Story over? No, life is more complicated. Start with, some of us have been unfairly advantaged. I'll speak for myself, though you can join me in yelling no fares if you feel it applies at any point. I was born a white male in the mid-20th century US. No fares. I grew up in a loving, stable, respectable family, and I never had to worry about food and shelter. No fares. When I took my first full-time job at age 26, after 9 years as a college and university student, I had a marketable credential and zero student debt. No fares. And so on and on. Oh, here's another one. As an adult, my typical experience of being stopped for speeding or whatever is for the police officer to give me a scolding and no ticket. No fares. Especially when I was younger, I took what I had for granted, and I was a bit jealous when I saw those with more. Especially as a music lover, I envied those whose voices were less foggy than mine, or whose fingers were less clumsy. And of course, there were always people who had material advantages that I lacked. There always are. But the bottom line is that I've been fortunate in life. Now, as a result, I tend to view persons less well off than myself as having gotten less than they deserved, which allows me to feel magnanimous without considering the possibility that the disparity between them and me is due to my having gotten more than I deserve, which I would, of course, be a rather uncomfortable thought. Moving on, though, time for another story, family story. This one dating to about 2005. Nancy and I were eating dinner at Wildflower Restaurant at Exit 17. I ordered a regular entree. Nancy favored something on the appetizer list, so she ordered it with extra shrimp or whatever, so it would suffice as a main course. It worked out fine. The servings she and I received were similarly ample. When we were done, I stayed to pay and she went out to the car. The bill for mine was $22 as expected. Hers was $13, $10 for the appetizer, $3 for the extra shrimp. I thought it was a bit low and I told them, but they insisted, so I left a generous tip and assumed that was the end of it. When I reached the car, I told Nancy that they charged $13 for her meal. She was indignant. She stomped back into the restaurant to complain and to insist on paying more. She was in effect yelling, no fares, but in that generous sense, not the resentful one. I was, of course, amused and proud. It's a response that a lot of us should probably have more often than we do, especially when we already have more than enough boxes to see over the fence and enjoy the ball game. But even those of us who want to be fair and who could spare a box or two, it's never that simple. Why isn't it so simple? Well, for one thing, in a face-to-face situation, we may fear that the other person may be insulted if we offer them something. More commonly, we can't even identify who who it is who's getting the short end of the stick, and we don't know who they are. I read an article last spring about how much harder COVID has made the already hard lives of fruit pickers in California. Now, I may be willing to pay more for the luscious fruit that I buy at Kroger in order for those pickers to have it better, but I have no obvious way to make it happen. Usually our transactions are impersonal. We don't have the kind of pathway to pursue fairness that Nancy did at the restaurant. By the way, the restaurant refused her too, which I thought was interesting. I was surprised because she was really on a tear. And even if we did, we faced the question of what is enough. How much generosity is required to attain equity? Perhaps the words of Jesus offer a useful guideline that from, quote, from everyone who has been given much, much will be required. Lovely, but a bit vague. How much do you have to be given for much to be required? And how much is much? There's a word that is relevant, one that is a bigger part of our vocabulary now than it was, say, 50 years ago. The word is entitlement. People are most likely to feel that they're being treated fairly when they're getting what they feel they're entitled to, which can be a bit subjective to say the least once our biological needs are all met. Judgments are often rooted in social comparisons. Indeed, we saw that with the monkey and the dogs, who apparently felt entitled to receive what they saw the other monkey or the other dog was getting. The little boy in the cartoon initially saw the older boys enjoying the baseball game and probably felt he was entitled to as well. And he no doubt felt that he was getting no more and no less than he deserved once he got the extra bucks to stand on. Yes, entitlement justice is often based on comparisons and analogies. A sighted person can travel on airplanes, so it's only fair that a blind person can do so as well, even if it means bringing their service dog along. And just as a blind person can bring a service dog, a person with anxiety disorder should get to bring their comfort iguana on the airplane too. Or should they? After all, the anxiety in question is rather subjective, isn't it? Allowing the individual himself to declare what he's entitled to can be a slippery slope, isn't it? To use another example, just as a blind person should have an accommodation when taking the SAT, a person with learning disorders should as well, or should they? After all, whether you're deemed to have a learning disorder, as opposed to simply lacking academic talent, may be determined in part by whether you can spend the money required to get an expert to write a needed evaluation letter for you. The point is that applying the logic of blindness to anxiety or learning disabilities can be a pathway to equity for sure, but it also can be subject to abuse for sure. Fact is that almost any symptom of standards, accommodations, and compensations can be gamed. I'm reminded of Jennifer Wagner's reflection from her days as a leader of Red Cross disaster relief missions. Quote, "First we dealt with the needy, then we dealt with the greedy." The challenge, of course, was to sort between those two groups, distinguish between them. More generally, it's easy for us to be quite generous to ourselves in deciding what we are entitled to. All it takes is to compare ourselves with people who are better off than we are, and even people who are objectively very well off, people who cannot deny that they have many more boxes than they deserve, tend to decide that they are entitled to benefit, maybe not for all of what I have, but certainly with most of it, with what I'm used to. We've all known people whom we would describe as having a sense of entitlement, and we do not admire them for that. On the other hand, I, as a psychologist, have on occasion dealt with fundamentally believed that they were not entitled to much of anything. That's not a good premise on which to build a fulfilling life. At a societal level, the big issue is what we could call the problem of caste. As an aside, I highly recommend the Isabel Wilkerson recent book entitled Caste, perhaps the best book I've read in a long time. Castes, hierarchies, class structures are all about the notions of entitlement, the assumption that different groups of people are entitled to receive different numbers of boxes, to live by different rules based on group membership. And castes are passed from generation to generation, even in a society like ours, which allows for some mobility. More about that later. Ultimately, the smallest subdivision of the caste to which you belong is, of course, your family, which leads to my next observation, that the context in which it is most common for people to behave unjustly is when they act to give their own family an unfair edge. The most glaring example in the news currently is of the rich celebrities who cheated to get their children admitted to elite universities. We would no doubt agree that such behavior crosses the line, especially since their kids were never going to be stuck outside the ball staring at the wall anyway. The kids really didn't need another box to stand on. But we should also acknowledge that in such situations, there's a collusion between two virtues, the virtue of following the rules of fairness and the virtue of making sure that one's children have the best possible chances to succeed. Ethicists acknowledge that partiality, keyword partiality, toward family is sometimes acceptable, indeed often admirable. You may even have a special moral obligation to care for a needy parent or spouse or child or sibling. And on the entitlement side of the docket, it's understood that each of us may expect something in the way of special support from our immediate relatives. Seems straightforward, but it often isn't. Other than the specific obligation that parents have to care for their dependent children, most of the rules pertaining to support among family members are unwritten and unclear. One brother may say to another, if you loved me like a brother should, you'd lend me $10,000, the $10,000 that I need just now. To which the other brother may reply, if you loved me like a brother should, you'd not be asking me to lend you $10,000 just now. More generally, sometimes people feel entitled to more partiality from their loved ones than the loved one feels it appropriate to give. One reason why families are, in general, the locus of both wondrous love and mutuality on the one hand, and deep resentment and horrific conflict on the other. But to put this in the context of fairness, to place no limits on the partiality toward members of one's family would be to fundamentally undercut the broader system of justice. If you think of the scourge of corruption, whether in 1920s Chicago or in current day Beirut, there's nothing more corrosive to society than people's willingness to do whatever it takes to protect their own family, their own tribe, their own whatever. I've noted in a prior message that justice and mercy are often in conflict. Here I'm noting that justice and loyalty can also be in conflict, loyalty to members of one's tribe and so on. A key to reining in corruption, of course, is the existence of a muscular and impartial judicial system. I recently spoke from this pulpit about symbols. The symbol I most revere is not the cross, it's not the flag, it's what's sometimes called Lady Justice, the image of the woman holding balance scales, and most importantly, wearing a blindfold, hence unaffected by considerations of family, tribe, caste, skin color, and so on. Actually, she should probably have some device on over her ears as well to keep her from being influenced by accent or dialect, which are among the more important social cues of caste, etc. But an issue that lurks in the shadows here, whether equity or fairness or justice is so elusive, so impossible that it's perhaps not even worth hoping for. There is within psychology an interesting research tradition going back over 50 years. It's known as the just world hypothesis. It's about a common cognitive bias, namely the assumption that our world somehow does ultimately ensure fair outcomes. The just world hypothesis tradition was initiated by a study in which students were told of two other students, one of whom had won a cash prize in a lottery and the other did not. The one who was, for no good reason, judged to be the harder worker of the two was, of course, the one who had gotten the prize. Many other studies since then have shown how common that bias is. It seems that we desire justice so much that we tend to fantasize that it prevails. One aspect of that bias is, of course, the tendency to blame the victim, even when the victim is clearly just the victim. There are social policy implications at stake here, regarding which I wish to quote at length from a recent London Review of Books essay by Stefan Collini, which addresses the issue of equality of opportunity, mobility, caste in a society like ours. He sets in opposition to one another what he calls the radical social theorist and the individualist. And I quote, "In much recent social science, study after study suggests that where people get in life is largely determined by where they start. But the fact is so easy to assemble. Yet the fact is that it is so easy to assemble the evidence for this truth that gives discussions of the topic a slightly tired, stale character. Journalists and politicians alike may express amazement and outrage at each fresh revelation that advantage is cumulative and self-perpetuating. But sociologists and radical social theorists can't fall back on saying, I told you so again and again and again and again, can they? Challenging, let alone reshaping, the individualists' dogmas that underwrite the discourse of opportunity is an uphill struggle, not least because it means departing from some of the common sense axioms about human agony and fairness that we all draw upon in our everyday social interactions. Collini doesn't mention it by name, but he's partly talking about the just world hypothesis, the bias of that sort, the assumption that if people don't turn out well, it's their own fault. When we're honest, we know sometimes winners don't deserve their good luck. Victims are sometimes blameless in every sense of the word. You may have read a few months ago that a couple, parents of 5 children, were killed when traveling on a forest road in California. What happened? A tree toppled on their car and killed them as they were driving along. 7 instant, blameless victims, the 2 parents and the 5 children they left behind. It's time for me to quote give another quotation from Jesus, in this case from the Sermon on the Mount. The Father who is in heaven makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the just and the unjust. If anything describes the futility of true justice on earth, that certainly does. Actually, there's an even stronger version captured in a little poem by Charles Bowen, a 19th century British jurist. It goes this way. The rain, it raineth on the just, and also on the unjust fella, but chiefly on the just because the unjust seals the just's umbrella. So yes, we have to acknowledge that there is an unfairness of nature and that it is compounded by human selfishness. But still we try. We have a justice system in which the stealing of an umbrella is a punishable offense. We have many mechanisms to help the downtrodden. One of them is an online entity called GoFundMe. In fact, an account was set up for those 5 children whose parents were crushed by a tree, and it soon attracted several $100,000, mainly from strangers. As in the cartoon, people sent their spare boxes. Maybe some even sent boxes that weren't exactly spares. My personal view, and here I'm winding down, is that when it comes to fairness and equity, the first priority should be the one implied in that cartoon, that everybody should get to see the game. Sure, it's nice to be tall enough to see it better, or rich enough to buy a good seat, but the key issue is that nobody be stuck staring at the wall. Society's efforts to compensate for the injustice meted out by human nature and by the selfishness of others will always fall short. But what we must not fall short on is providing enough opportunity for children to have a fighting chance at thriving as they move through life. The place to start in addressing injustice is where the consequences of injustice are the most dire, namely with respect to true deprivation. Thank you.